Welcome, everyone. I think we're on page 64 in the Theory and Practice of Universal Ethics, the Noahide Laws, by Rabbi Dr. Shimon Dovid Cowen of Australia. Page 64, that would be in part 1, chapter 3, section 2, towards the top of 64. A lot of what we're going to be discussing in today's class is very much Torah-based, Torah, especially according to Hasidus, and he deals with it, as he's been doing until now pretty much, comparing it or using different philosophy. And again, as we've seen, he seems to very much hold of Viktor Frankl's approach. So even though Viktor Frankl may not say it in so many words, but that's really a lot of things that he says are right on target. Now, in this section, he's going to go through different parts, different of the 7 Noahide commandments, and explain how they work within the psyche of the person. And we're going to, in general, break it down to 2 parts. There is, as he says right here, look in the top 2, the structure of human personality, the self and the other. Okay, all of us deal with ourselves, and then we deal with the other. And that's going to be how we're going to explain the Noahide commandments and the obligation that we have to keep these divine laws and the benefit that we have personally and for society. So let's just begin inside the best that we can do, and then we'll discuss it. All right, page 64, the self and the other. What constitutes the foundation for an ethical personality is the ability to direct oneself to the moral mandates and needs of one's higher self and a self-transcending perspective. In other words, we're not animals, and therefore we cannot be selfish. And just because there's immediate gratification, or I want, or I feel, that's not the way to behave. The movement from self-absorption to self-control and self-transcendence begins with the ability of the person to contain unruly impulse at the most basic level by delaying its gratification. So we're not even saying that the person needs to completely negate whatever physical pleasure they want to engage in, but the delay is the key. For example, it's brought down in the Tanya, which we've mentioned many times, by Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the first Chabad Lubavitch Rebbe, and in his most basic seminal work of the Tanya, he quotes over there from the Talmud that in the times of the Talmudic sages, some of them would delay the first main meal of the day, where most people at that time in that society would eat it in the 4th hour of the day. So let's say that's roughly 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. And they would delay it by 2 hours, and they would only eat at midday. And that's what it says in the Talmud. Comes along the author of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, and he asks, what's the point? They're learning all day anyway, and they're eating a meal to fuel their body so that they can learn. It doesn't say they would eat any less. They would delay the time of their meal. What's the difference? After they finished learning, they would immediately resume to learning. So whether they finish eating their brunch at 10 a.m. or 12 a.m. or noon, what's the difference? And he says it's the delay, which is that act of self-control and of so to say, breaking one's own self-indulgence. So we're not saying not to eat or to eat any less, just that delay. All right, let's continue. The basic test is being able to wait and not do a prohibited act in order to have something which will be available and permitted shortly. Now, actually, at least according to some opinions in the tradition, in the Torah tradition, regarding Adam, the first man, with the original sin of eating from the tree of knowledge. So in Midrash, in the oral tradition, there is an opinion that the tree of knowledge that was prohibited for Adam and Eve to partake of was a vine, grapes, and it wasn't that they were never going to be allowed to partake and eat from that. He was going to use it to recite the Kiddush at night when Shabbos would come in after nightfall. This was Friday, and then those grapes would be wine, and he would recite the Kiddush that we do over a cup of wine. In other words, it was a simple delay of just a couple of hours because the sin took place on Friday afternoon. So you're talking about self-control, not to partake of that particular fruit for a couple of hours. And that was the whole test, which they failed. It is not sufficient, however, merely to be able to delay gratification, a function of a regulative ego, but also to relate to a moral mandate and rationale for that delaying or checking of impulse. In other words, why are you delaying it? To delay it, that's step number one. Some people have trouble with that, but he says that's not enough. The capacity for self-transcendence and self-control does not occur without conscious, which in turn is related to that which conscious intuits, the divine, which gave conscious its content. Okay, that's really because otherwise, why do we even have a conscience? What is that about the human being? We feel that guilty about certain things. Where does that feeling come from? Okay, it's really a divine gift, if you will, or it's just that we're programmed, and that's part of how we are. The failure of an adult person in self-control is the most abject failure. That one cannot even wait, and even at the cost of suffering to others, uncontrollably seizes that which, with a little patience, would shortly have become permissible. By the same token, high refinement of the person in this realm, that one shows restraint, even for that which is presently permissible. That's another level. Because right now it's allowed. You don't have to delay. And yet the person shows restraint, is the loftiest accomplishment. This signifies that beyond self-control and fulfillment of one's experienced needs, one is progressing toward a transformation of perceived needs themselves. In the language of Kabbalah and Hasidus, there is a concept, it's an Aramaic word. The term is iskafia, which means to force or to compel, to suppress, depending on the context of how we're using the word, but it's a form of suppression. And that's an amazing thing. It says when an individual does that, the divine is like, it makes so much, so to say, pleasure for God Almighty. When an individual is able to suppress their desire and their impulsive wants. Top of page 65. The polar extremes in personal self-control are exemplified in the human being's relationship towards food, a piece of physical nature. Now, again, as we're going to say, it's not only food, but that's just, in a sense, the easiest thing to deal with. So that's why so much of ethics, whether it's called Musar, Jewish ethics, or Hasidus, the example given very often is food, but it's not just that. The Bible symbolizes uncontrolled desire in one who tears and consumes the limb of a living creature without waiting for its preparation through slaughter. This is at the cost of great suffering to the animal. The refined human being, on the other hand, is typically one who shows restraint in eating food, even which is permissible and was achieved through minimal suffering to the animal, and who eats it not solely to satisfy desire, but in order to serve his or her creator. So it's not just that, oh, it's going to taste much better if I do all these preparations. Well, it'll take time for it to cook and etc., but it'll be worth it. That's, if you need to use that mechanism or that technique to fool yourself or to control yourself, fine, so be it. But that's not the ideal. That's not what we're talking about over here. We're talking about being able to wait because you have a higher calling. You're serving Hashem. You're serving God Almighty. The ability to control oneself or orient oneself to conscious bears on all the internal dimensions of the self: body, mind, and soul, as well as to the others to which the self externally relates, whether it's God, other persons, and nature. So we have two sides: one, towards yourself and for yourself. And then there's the other, which includes God and other people and animals and everything, God's world. Internal dimensions of personality. The bodily dimension. The human being, as explained by the Maharal of Prague, which we discussed him, I believe was the previous class, is a composite of body, intellect, and a higher unitary existence of mind and body, which we have chosen to call also the spiritual or soul dimension. The principal impulse of the bodily existence of a person is desire. In the Hebrew, in the Holy Tongue, it's called ta'ava, or commonly pronounced taiva. That means desire. This was the true insight of classic psychoanalysis in relation to eros, though it did not adequately distinguish between raw libido and its higher transformation into or fusion with love. Hence, desire can be preoccupied with self-gratification, or it can be unselfishly incorporated into a fusion and union with another, to which one brings oneself, and through which one actualizes one's complete self. Okay, now you can see where he's going to go with this, but in a relationship, is the person thinking what's in it for me or what's in it for the other, or both? There's a joke, little color, horny, whatever. But someone says, I love fish. I love fish. And the other person tells them, no, you don't. You love yourself. You love the taste of the dead fish in your mouth. You want to eat fish. If you loved fish, you would never eat any fish because you would want them all to live. And you'd be upset that people go fishing and people eat fish. So you don't love fish, you love yourself. Okay, but there's some depth to that. For instance, I love meat. You love meat. So why are you eating all these animals if you love meat? You love dead animals and you want them to be prepared and then eat them. So when we're in a relationship and you say, I love that person, I love my spouse, hopefully it's in a proper, healthy way. But sometimes the person is coming to it as a self-desire, and I want, and it feels good. So you really don't really care about that person for themselves. Let's continue. The desire of the material or bodily aspect of the person also has forms and objects. It is libidious. It also desires possessions. Thus, the quality of the body is its wanting. Though that wanting could take an altruistic form for another, or even in relation to itself, as a disinterested concern for the body's maintenance, as distinct from indulgence. Gordon Allport was primarily concerned with the emotive personality of the human, spoke of its character of striving, its desire for actualization. The effective nature of a human being wants to enlarge itself in some sense. It wants and drives to join and meet with its objects. Okay. The disciplined and self-transcending self is that which gives this effective relationship a moral and spiritual character, such as the bonds of love and fellowship. All right, so that's the bodily dimension and how we're supposed to deal with it properly. Then we said, according to the Maharal of Prague, we have two more, intellect and then the higher. So now we're going to move on to the intellectual dimension of the human being. The distinguishing quality of the intellectual or cognitive dimension of the human being is its ability to rise above, survey, and elevate impulses, emotions, and perceptions of the bodily self. So bodily would be much lower, and then you have the intellect. As such, it has a quality of abstraction. The intellectual self judges. It conceptualizes. It has the ability to hold back from immediate effective response or perception and to judge it, almost as if you're a third party, an outsider, to step out of yourself. The task of intellect is rather to allow itself to be drawn towards truth, to practice critical review of personal bias and immediate perception. It must be wary of enshrining partiality, of rationalizing particular interests into a general principle. That is, it must see to it that unreflected emotions, interests, and perceptions do not bribe the properly dispassionate scheme of reason. In Hasidus, it's basically the idea of, well, it comes from Kabbalah, that the mind can rule the heart, or as the expression goes, mind over matter. But it's really that the human being has the ability, with their intellect, with your mind, to control your behavior for sure, and to be a proper judge. In other words, you can't judge based on your feelings and your emotions most of the time. There are times where you're supposed to go with your, as they call it, as the expression goes in America, your gut feeling. There are times that you're supposed to follow your heart. But as a rule, you're supposed to follow your mind. And your mind is supposed to be able to analyze something without being all entangled emotionally into it, without being bribed, and to understand the situation, to assess it, and then to affect your heart in that regard. The proper function of intellect, however, is not only to practice a critical review of perception, emotion, and bias. It is also to know that the ultimate first principles, which it requires in order to interpret and explain experience, are beyond an outside intellect. A mistake a lot of people make is they think that the highest form is intellect. No, you have to intellectually understand that there is above and beyond intellect. Pragmatically, it might make assumptions, test their workability with regard to the data of experience, and use the resultant theories for their practical effectiveness. The ultimate truth of those assumptions, hypotheses, and principles, however, is beyond the discernment of intellect itself. Accordingly, when it comes to objective truth, intellect must acknowledge and be drawn to something higher than itself for the true first principles, on the basis of which intellect is to build and work. So it gets a little bit, I don't know, confusing, but a little bit slippery. Is it blind faith? Like, at what point does intellect come in? So you could start with intellect, but intellectually, you will come to understand that there needs to be that which is beyond intellect. So to intellectually understand that I must surrender to something beyond. Sort of the story of Avraham Avinu, Abraham, how he came to discover God, whatever age it was, but he was thinking, analyzing, and then he came to certain conclusions. Arguably, most of them, one might say, were what God cannot be, and what cannot be God, and what isn't, and by way of negating all of the beliefs at that time. And then he came to a point, as the verse says, that he believed. It doesn't say he knew or saw. It says he believed. He had faith. So what does that mean? He just decided, why should I believe in this, that, and the other? Let me have blind faith in monotheism. That's not at all how it was. He intellectually came to the conclusion that he has to have faith, belief. On the psychological plane, intellect is capable of formulating both morally acceptable and unacceptable frameworks of orientation for emotion. The assurance that intellect is properly in charge of emotion rather than being its unconscious advocate obtains when intellect is receptive to that which is higher than both it and emotion. That is, to conscience or the soul. This occurs when the self-transcending intellect consciously seeks direction upward beyond the psychophysical self for the values on which to base the understanding which guides conduct in the world. Sometimes, all too often, as the expression goes, that the person first shoots the arrow and then they make the target. That's how you're guaranteed to get a bullseye. So sometimes very intelligent people, they rationalize things and they explain their emotions or their behavior. But that's not really, they're not being truthful, whether it's with others or themselves as well. It's not that they first intellectually thought this through, came to this conclusion, and now they have this emotion. That's sometimes how it works. Like in a relationship, let's just say for a moment, with an individual and God, sometimes one can fall in love with God or revere God and fear God, all starting with intellect. It can be completely an intellectual exercise, which one goes through different steps and then concentrates, meditates, and that in turn will arouse and awaken their emotions in their heart of love and fear or whatever. That's one process, and that works. Another way would be at times that the person just has this feeling, this overwhelming feeling. And then to either justify it or not to feel like I'm just impulsive, I want to be a higher form of creation, I want to be an intellectual. So then they begin to rationalize their feeling. It could be in a good situation or it could be not good or doesn't matter. So you have to really be intellectually honest. I mean, for example, if a person is thrown into a certain situation, a very dangerous situation, they will immediately, without any thought, fall into this state of tremendous fear and will be palatable. Their heartbeat, everything. If you take a person and he suddenly finds himself in the lion's den, all of a sudden he's in a lion's den and there he sees the ferocious lion. He need not think and calculate. Immediately, like that, the person will be so scared. So sometimes it starts with the emotions. What we're talking about over here is that the lowest level is the body, the emotions, the feelings. The higher is intellect, but then the intellect has to surrender intellectually to that which is higher. Just let me mention a story of someone who reached a very high level of his mind being able to control his heart. It was a disciple, a follower, a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, or Rabbi Shneur Zalman of the Tanya. His name, well, doesn't matter. Anyway, so this particular follower, long story, during the war between then Russia and Napoleon, France, War of 1812, believe it or not, the Alter Rebbe had a spy because Alter Rebbe was very strongly rooting for the Russians to win the war, not for Napoleon, against Napoleon. So he had a follower who knew how to speak French with a French accent. He was very good at languages. And he was in the camp of the French to be able to get information and give it over to the Russian authorities. So he was a spy. And then the way the story goes, in our tradition, we have this story. I don't think it's in the history books. Napoleon got suspicious or heard that there's some Jew, and because it wasn't clear what the Jews held, because other great leaders did want Napoleon to win. So it wasn't obvious what was good for the Jews. Anyway, he comes barging in, and this was Napoleon himself, comes barging into that room, and he walks straight over to this Jew and places his hand on the guy's heart. And I mean, anybody would be startled. Forget about it if you're a spy or not. Napoleon walks over to any soldier, and just puts his hand on your heart, the mirror, and he felt his heartbeat, and he trusted that he's fine. Nothing to be concerned with. In other words, this person beat Napoleon. And when later, when he was asked, how in the world did you do that? How were you not naturally, you could put on a show externally, You could show a face but how can you control your heartbeat? So he said one of the basic tenets, one of the first things we learned when we came to the Rebbe, to the Alter Rebbe, was that you have to learn to have your mind control your heart. Your mind has to control your heart. And therefore, he was able to control his heartbeat. That's a very high level. And you think that's a basic level in Hasidus. One other story, also of a disciple of the Alter Rebbe. And there was a group of Hasidim, followers of the Alter Rebbe, and they were sitting and they were partying, as these great Hasidim do. It's a uplifting, happy, fun, spiritual brotherhood awakening, and customarily you say l'chaim on some strong drink, and then you need food to help wash it down as a chaser. Okay. Anyway, so there was being prepared a delicacy, happened to be, wasn't just a little bit of herring or some bread or a piece of cake, but it was actually roasted lung. Hey, a big delicacy. And as it was roasting, the aroma was just something out of the world. So the one who was serving was this particular chassid, who in a certain way was a gesture. Everyone knew him as such. Many stories about him. So he was coming around giving the food. And he was dancing around because it's a very joyous, happy atmosphere anyway. Everyone's singing. So he's dancing around as he's waiting upon the people. And when it came to this big bowl of the meat, the lung, he comes in and he's dancing around, and said, okay, well, give it to us already. And he was just running around, and they said, come on, enough. Got to a point where it wasn't funny any longer because they really wanted to eat this. And everybody there, the older Hasidim, as well as the younger ones, were basically frustrated, and he took the joke too far. So he said, just give it to us. It's not funny any longer. We're not enjoying your games. And they were ready to forcefully take it from him. He basically then dumped it into the mud. He ruined the whole thing. They're very upset with him, needless to say. So they put him in his place. They actually took him and gave him a beating. Just as that was happening, the butcher's wife, I think, and I'm sorry, it was the sheikhet. There are two people. One is the butcher, and one is the sheikhet, the ritual slaughterer. So the ritual slaughterer, he slaughters the meat, and then checks to the kosher, and then the butcher is the one who cuts it up and makes it ready. So the sheikhet's wife came running in, and she said, stop, please, nobody eat the lung, don't you dare eat it. And they all stop what they're doing and they look at her, and she's very frantic. They said, what is it? Terrible mistake has happened. Terrible mistake. I'm so sorry. What happened? So the sheikhet was out of town, the one who slaughtered the meat. And it was a mix-up. There was a mistake. And the wrong meat of the wrong animal, the non-kosher animal, was given to the butcher as kosher meat. And it was all inadvertent. And therefore, when they went to get this lung, it was actually from an animal which was strayed from. It was found to be not kosher. And they suddenly realized that this friend of theirs, Reb Shmuel, saved them from the very terrible, terrible sin of eating non-kosher meat. So the young people, like, they felt so grateful to him and so terrible that they laid a hand on him, they backed off. Then, I'll tell you the rest of the story, the elder Hasidim, and you have to really know what Hasidus demands and what Hasidim are like, especially back then, to have an appreciation for this. The elder Hasidim, they said, really? Now it's our turn to give you what you have coming. How dare you play around and use divine spiritual intervention? What are you, a Rebbe? You have prophecy of some sort? That doesn't fly. No. We're not going to accept that. And he says, I promise you, I don't have any divine, spiritual, anything. I'm not a prophet of any sort. How did I know that something was wrong with this meat? Because I saw the desire that we all had for it. Such a lust. Everybody was craving for that meat to such an extent, something had to be wrong. It couldn't be that it was from the side of holiness. Because of the feeling of desire and lust that we all had for it, I knew something was off. I knew we couldn't eat this meat. Anyhow, let's try to get up to the next piece. Okay. The unitary dimension. Unitary dimension of the person is that level at which intellect and body cohere in a common purpose or directedness. This is the whole person and is expressed as a distinct facet or level of personality. Concerning this dimension of personality, the Maharal of Prague states, okay, now we're going to quote from the Maharal. The parts of the human being are body and the intellectual soul, the mind. The human being as a whole comprises these parts in that through them together, the person receives the form of the human. So it's basically that you have the two together, the soul and the body. This third dimension is like a house, which has as its parts wood and stones. But afterwards is made a house, compounded of both. It is something other than its parts. So the materials that you will use to build a house, at the end, you don't say, oh, this is wood and stones. No, this is a finished product called a house, a complete house. This unity of body, physical, and mind, psyche, is described by Viktor Frankl as the spiritual bearer of the psychophysical, as the essential you, an invisible essential identity. And now we're going to quote Viktor Frankl. For who, for example, does not believe in the you of the next person? And isn't this you, as the spiritual bearer of the entire psychophysical organism, in fact, invisible? Isn't the person of the other as that core which hides behind its psychophysical forms of manifestation and expression, that spiritual identity, which the other person does not, as physical or mental, have, but rather precisely is really totally imperceptible and only somehow graspable behind that which is outwardly perceived. It is this highest faculty of the human being, soul, which unites and directs both body and mind and answers for both of them. For neither could be responsible for deeds, not the flesh alone, nor disembodied consciousness alone. The soul is answerable to God, not only because it is the master of body and mind, but also because as the divine likeness in the human, it knows its master, God. See, the Talmud gives a story, whatever, about the resurrection of the dead. So it says that it gives a parable that if you have a person who is lame, cannot walk, then you have another person who's blind, cannot see, and they both want to go into a vineyard and steal grapes. But how are they going to do it? The blind man can't see where he's going, and the lame man can't go. So they have a plan. And they said, why don't you get on my shoulders or on my back, and you direct me where to go. So the blind man is carrying the lame man who can see and navigate. They go there and they eat their desire. And then afterwards, when they're caught and they're brought to be judged, so each one of them claims, how in the world can I be guilty? This one says, I'm lame, I can't go anywhere. The other one says, I'm blind, I can't see anything. So what does the wise judge do? He says, please take the lame man, put him on the back of the blind man, and let's punish them like that. Let's give them their, flogging that way. So similarly, after a person passes away, who's accountable and who is the heavenly court supposed to judge? The soul, soul says, what did I do? I didn't do anything without a body. I didn't do anything wrong. And the body says, without a soul, I'm just, a sack of bones, a dead piece of meat. Like, what am I? So therefore, they're brought back together. So similar to what we're saying over here. Okay, I think we're going to have to stop at this point. Yeah. So at page 69, we're up to the external dimensions of human personality. All right, and now it's time for us to open up the floor for anyone and everyone who has anything to share, say, ask, clarify. Please.
I just want to ask a question, Rabbi. I've learned the Ramhold describes that we perceive what we see, but our neshama sees something different. Is this where he's sort of what he's saying?
In a sense. It's not exactly that point, but it doesn't contradict the Ramchal. Yes.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Anyone else? Is James there from James on? Either James?
James Gosnell?
Or James,
and James
from Springfield?
I'm here.
I'm here.
Okay.
I don't have any questions, but I do appreciate
Aaron?
it.
Is the floor open for any question?
What was that?
This is James Bakunis. Is the floor open to any type of general question?
I guess so. Go ahead. Go for it.
All right, thank you. Forgive me. I don't mean to seem to be, obtuse or anything, but.
Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. Hello, James?
Yes.
I just want to put it out there. Don't forget that there's the Fifth Amendment, which I can exercise at any given time. Okay, having said that, go ahead.
Well said, sir. Well said and well done. Thank you. I was just, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I think you might, I don't know, I'm sure you're aware of what's going on with the Chabad things in New York. Do you have any kind words you could say, or, anything you could give us some insight on about that situation?
So you're not asking for my opinion. You want kind words.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot, sir.
That's why I said about the Fifth Amendment. I thought you might be going there. So let me just say 2 points. And some of you may not even be aware of what we're talking about because we're talking in riddles, and I'll just leave it that way for now. For one, I choose, at this point at least, not to discuss it in this form. I mean, this is being recorded, and we're going to be uploading it, whatever. So I choose not to discuss it. Having said that, though, point number 2. Whether the events were very good and commendable, or very terrible and despicable, or somewhere in between, or a combination of both. I'm not addressing that. What I do want to point out, especially since you asked me to say something kind, what I do want to point out is there is a pamphlet, and it's translated into English actually, that the Rabbi Melech HaMashiach edited his own works. He gave it out as an official, formal booklet of an essay of his talks, where he explains 770 Eastern Parkway, his synagogue, that house of prayer and Torah study. And in it, he explains that it is the substitute for the Holy Temple. It is the microcosmic, the miniature temple during the time of exile. So once the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, so based on the Talmud's interpretation of a verse in Ezekiel, there are synagogues, and there's primarily one synagogue, which in every generation throughout the diaspora is the primary substitute for the Holy Temple. And then he uses a terminology that the Talmud says based on a verse, how all mouths turn in that direction, and how in the Holy Temple, and to this day, that is the direction that the Jewish people pray towards. That's why in this part of the world, we pray, well, I say in the United States, I'm not talking about Australia. In this part of the world here, we pray towards the east. Not because the sun rises in the east, nothing to do with that at all. No, God forbid, we're not praying towards the sun. We're praying to the east, towards the east, because that's the direction of Israel, Jerusalem, the Holy Temple. And in Babylon, in the times of the Talmud, they actually prayed towards the west. So the words are teil talpios, and we interpret that to mean a high place that all, this is allegorically speaking, all mouths turn in that direction. And then he explains that more and more people should be flocking in the time of exile to 770, such that we need to expand 770. And he even explains how the Noahides should also be coming to 770. Now, when you learn that, if you're very idealistic, when you learn that pamphlet, you walk away with the feeling that there should be, and I don't mean to exaggerate, there should be millions of people, not only Jews, that are focused on this synagogue, which we affectionately call by its address, 770. And then when I look in my perception of reality, it always bothered me why that's not the case. I can explain, as many others of my friends and colleagues can explain, why people don't come. It's just not necessarily the most attractive synagogue. There are other buildings that by far that they're, interior and their exterior. It's just, why can't they make this such a beautiful place? But I always wondered, and practically speaking, it's not even easy to bring people or Noahides. Like, how do you get people to just get their attention, just pay attention, and just talk about, just look at, just know about this center? And somehow, in one day, I mean, on the social media and all that, whatever it is, millions of views. It's incredible. Millions of people, whether they're Jews or lahavdil, Noahides, are focusing, are looking at 770. So
Well,
I hope
sir. And, you know, I've gotten my information regarding this situation from the New York Post. And so, but I also, when you said like the difficulty of getting Noahides, I remember your son had shared something with me when Mashiach comes and the temple will be rebuilt. Am I correct in recalling? He says all the temples, all the shuls, and everything like that will be uprooted from where they at, and will end up surrounding temple in that time.
That's this essay I'm talking. All of that is in this particular essay, right?
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Happy New Year.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, all the best, everybody. Next week, we are not on for the class. Sorry. We're not last minute notice, but next week, I plan on being out of town. Actually, I plan on going to 770 in honor of the 10th of Shabbat, the anniversary of the beginning of the leadership of the Rabbi Melech HaMashiach. 74 years ago. So next Thursday, we don't have class scheduled, and hopefully the following week.
The following week will be Shot.
Okay.
Or actually be the day after, I guess.
It'll be right.
16.
Huh?
Meet 16.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Maybe we'll have some food. Okay, very good. Be well, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi Turin.
Thank you.
Pleasure. All the best,
Layla
everyone.
Tov. Layla
You too.
Tov.
Keep up
All the best,
Mashiach.
everyone.
Okay. See you in 2 weeks.